This might sound strange, but bear with me. Back in high school, there was a kid who claimed he was a demon. For reasons you'll soon understand, I don't feel comfortable sharing his real name, so let's just call him Alex. Despite his name sounding like something out of a classic play, he was incredibly socially awkward. He had this empty stare that made even the teachers uneasy. He wore the same faded gray hoodie every single day. No exaggeration. I'm pretty sure he never washed it because he always had a terrible smell. He was of average height and appearance, but you'd hardly notice since he always had his hood pulled up and sunglasses on, even indoors. Eventually, the teachers stopped asking him to take them off. Here's where it gets weird. Alex had no friends, but had a strange habit of adopting people. If he decided he liked you, which could happen on a whim, he'd walk up and declare you adopted, meaning you were now part of his circle. Apparently, this meant you were safe from him or something. That's what he claimed, at least. The truth is, he didn't like many people, so very few were ever adopted. I was one of the few, likely because he had a crush on me. None of us took his demon claims seriously. We all assumed he was just a troubled kid, which he definitely was. Oh, and I should mention this all took place in Brookfield, where I grew up. Another girl I used to be friends with, Mia, had also been adopted by him. Alex's crush on her was more obvious, and everyone noticed. One day, my friends and I were hanging out in the dugouts behind our high school, just passing the time. Me, Mia, Jake, and Ryan. Somehow the conversation shifted to Alex's crush on Mia, and we all started laughing while Mia looked embarrassed. I can't recall exactly what we called him, but we had a nickname we used to avoid saying his real name. However, this time, I distinctly remember Mia using Alex's actual name. The moment she did, he appeared out of nowhere, jumping onto the dugout with a baseball bat in hand. It wasn't scary in the usual sense, but it was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen. We all fell silent, worried he'd overheard us talking. He didn't say anything, just stared at us. I gave him a hesitant wave, and he nodded back before jumping down and walking away. After we were sure he was gone, we erupted into laughter, trying to find humor in the bizarre encounter. But inside, I felt a bit shaken. The next incident I remember was far creepier. I was at Mia's house, and we were hanging out in her room with her parents at home. For some reason, we mentioned Alex's name 3 times within 10 minutes. Suddenly, we heard the front door slam shut. Confused, we went downstairs to see if one of our other friends had arrived. Mia's mom beat us to the door, and to our shock, there stood Alex talking to her. When she asked what he was doing there, he replied, "I was summoned." Mia's mom made small talk before politely asking him to leave, which he did in silence. While her mom seemed unfazed, Mia and I were horrified. As we walked back upstairs, we exchanged wide-eyed looks, realizing how creepy it was. We connected the dots. He seemed to show up when his name was said 3 times. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but we both witnessed 2 unexplainable events and knew about Alex's history of claiming to be a demon. How else could we rationalize it? We warned all our friends never to say his name 3 times again. Things were calm for a few months, and I thought maybe I had overreacted. That was until one day when my friend group was hanging out at Ryan's house. We were relaxing on the back deck when, inevitably, the topic of Alex came up again. Despite our warnings, Ryan jokingly said his name 3 times in a row. When nothing happened, he laughed, telling us we were silly for believing in such nonsense. I felt a mix of annoyance and relief, until a few minutes later, when Alex suddenly jumped over Ryan's backyard fence. Ryan was the first to notice, going silent mid-sentence as we all froze in fear. We watched Alex stare at us for a moment before jumping back over the fence and disappearing. Ryan freaked out, accusing us of conspiring with Alex to scare him. We insisted we'd warned him not to say anything. After a long, tense silence, Ryan told us to go home, clearly shaken. The last incident involving Alex was definitely the most frightening. A few months later, I was home alone one night, a rare occurrence since my parents usually stayed in. I decided to invite over a guy I'd been talking to. We were hanging out in my room while it rained lightly outside. At some point, he brought up Alex, making me visibly cringe. When I explained the situation, He burst out laughing and said he was going to scream Alex's name to scare me. I begged him not to, but he did it anyway, yelling Alex's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. Immediately, the rain intensified, and a flash of lightning lit up the room. I started to panic. The guy tried to assure me it was just a coincidence, but I was too freaked out. I rushed to my window to check the storm, and that's when I screamed. There, in my driveway, stood a silhouette looking up at me. It was too dark to see clearly, but I was 99% sure it was Alex. I shut the blinds and ran downstairs to lock all the doors. As I secured the back door, I saw him again. This time, standing motionless in my front yard. A panic attack started to rise, and I feared Alex was going to find a way inside. In a desperate attempt to ward him off, I started shouting, "I'm adopted," over and over again, hoping it would do something. I knew he couldn't hear me, but my mind was racing. The guy I was with ran down the stairs and lifted me off the kitchen floor to comfort me. I looked out the window again, but he was gone. The storm continued to rage, but I had no intention of searching the property. The next morning, after the guy left, I went outside to inspect the yard. To my horror, I found something sinister in the far corner, Alex's hoodie. Inside it were a couple of my belongings that I thought I had lost. With my parents gone again, I felt too scared to call the police. I decided to show my parents what I found after school the next day, but I never got the chance. The next day, Alex didn't show up at school. He didn't come the day after that either. None of us ever saw him again, and no one knew what happened to him. My parents still live in that house, which is something that haunts me. I know this isn't your typical scary story, but I felt the need to share it. Some people at school said they caught Alex hiding and eavesdropping on their conversations, which might explain how he was able to appear out of nowhere. As I've grown older, I've come to think that Alex was just a mentally ill stalker who followed me and possibly other girls around. Hence why he always showed up when his name was mentioned. The thought of him lurking around, listening to me, sends chills down my spine. I can't even begin to imagine where he might be now. So, this is a story from a few years back. My friend Jake and I were on our way to a dinner party one snowy Saturday evening. Before heading to the party, we decided to stop at a liquor store. Honestly, it felt like a hassle with the snow coming down, but we didn't want to show up empty-handed. We picked out some local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey, then headed back to the car. I remember the snow was really starting to pick up, but we were used to it. Jake dashed back into the store to grab a pack of nicotine pouches, his latest obsession. I was a bit annoyed because I was driving, and my car wasn't the best in snowy conditions. After a few minutes, he hopped back into the car, and I pulled out of the parking lot. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the roads in a thick layer of white. The drive was supposed to be straightforward, about 20 to 30 minutes through familiar suburban neighborhoods. But of course, things never go as planned. The snowstorm turned what should have been an easy trip into a nerve-wracking ordeal. Let me just say, I'm not the best driver under normal circumstances, and the car slipping every 10 seconds didn't help. After some tense moments driving uphill, I turned a corner and was met with a sight no one wants to see. A car stopped in the middle of the road with its hazard lights flashing ominously, cutting through the falling snow like distress signals. Both the driver's and passenger's doors were wide open. I was tempted to drive around it and continue on my way, but Jake insisted we stop. You can judge me if you want, but I'm not your typical Good Samaritan. I've had too many experiences that have made me distrustful of strangers. I told him we were late, but he urged me to stop, sounding genuinely concerned. Jake had gotten me into trouble before with his curiosity, but this felt different. Someone might be in trouble. Reluctantly, I stopped the car, and we sat in silence for a few moments. Jake asked if we should check it out, and I told him that was the plan. He rolled his eyes, pointing out that watching from the car wouldn't accomplish anything. He was kind of right, but I really didn't want to get out. Nervous about the situation, I asked him to wait a few more minutes, which he reluctantly agreed to. We sat there, watching the eerie blinking of the hazard lights against the beautiful snowy backdrop. After a while, Jake said he'd had enough and was going to investigate. Before I could protest, he stepped out of the car. I watched, feeling a rising sense of dread as he approached the vehicle. As he did, I thought I saw something dark move out of the corner of my eye. Maybe it was just my anxious mind playing tricks, but the situation was feeling worse by the second. Not even 10 seconds later, I thought I saw the car jolt slightly, like something had shifted in the trunk or back seat. Again, maybe my imagination was running wild, but I didn't care. I made a snap decision and slammed on the horn, startling Jake, who was inspecting the inside of the vehicle. He understood my message and sprinted back to the car. I drove off immediately, telling him my suspicion that the whole thing was a trap. He was annoyed, pointing out that I had no real proof, but I firmly replied that I wasn't going to risk my life for someone who could easily call for help. The rest of the drive was tense. Jake was the kind of guy who held grudges longer than most. When we finally arrived at the dinner party, things felt normal again. We were there for several hours, and we almost forgot about the earlier incident. After a nice dinner and catching up with friends, our host turned on the TV to give some departing guests an update on the snowstorm. He switched to the local news, and what I saw sent chills down my spine. The police were reporting a stolen vehicle that had been taken not even 2 hours earlier. They were sharing a description from the victim, who recounted how she was driving her teenage son home when they noticed a car in the middle of the road with its hazards on and doors open. As they approached, 2 men jumped out from behind a snowbank and another emerged from the trunk. They held the woman at gunpoint, demanding her keys, and then sped off with her car and the one that had been used to lure her in. I stared at Jake in sheer fear. That could have been us. We quickly told the rest of the party about what had happened earlier, which put a damper on the atmosphere, but people were fascinated by the story. The worst part of this experience is that it made me even more distrustful of strangers than I was before. I often think about how many people I might have helped in a time of need if I hadn't encountered such a meticulously crafted trap. The events I'm about to share happened over 30 years ago during my childhood, so some details may be fuzzy. At around 10 years old, I was part of a large extended family, with my dad being one of 9 siblings. My grandparents owned a massive beachfront property where we spent our summers, often surrounded by relatives. That summer, I began experiencing disturbing nightmares, graphic scenarios involving family members dying or being abandoned. One particularly haunting dream featured a false awakening where I found my family missing, leaving me in a state of despair. After several nights of these nightmares, I confided in my favorite uncle, Joe, who was a therapist. He listened intently and suggested I reflect on my feelings towards my parents, claiming I harbored unresolved resentment. Confused, I followed his advice to act out against my parents, but this only made the nightmares worse. When I returned to Uncle Joe for help, he hinted at needing to set my mind free, but I was terrified to learn more. One night, I woke up in fear and heard whispers I believed were from Uncle Joe. I screamed, causing him to flee my room. Panicking, I told my parents everything. My dad confronted Uncle Joe, who denied any wrongdoing. But when my dad searched Uncle Joe's satchel, he found disturbing notes about inducing nightmares and other unsettling materials. Uncle Joe was arrested later, and I never saw him again. Looking back, I often regret my naivety during that time, but there's nothing I can do now.